Ottawa is a city that sees protests of all shapes and sizes all year, every year. But the one that descended in February seemingly confounded the Ottawa Police Service at the outset. And as it deepened its hold on the city, raised some fairly profound questions about how policing itself works and how it might be improved. To help us consider some of that, we welcome, in central Ottawa, Sandy Smallwood, former vice chair of the Ottawa Police Services Board. In the downtown core of the nation's capital, Matt Scoff, president of the Ottawa Police Association. In Kanata, in the West End, Michael Kempa, associate professor of criminology at the University of Ottawa. And in the Kensington Market area of the provincial capital, Kareem Assad, lawyer, activist, and citizen journalist who covered the convoy in Ottawa. And we welcome all of you to TVO tonight for this conversation about something that quite captivated the nation not all that long ago. Michael, let me start with you, and I wonder if you can sort of give us a little policing 101 here. Take us through the hierarchy of police services in Ontario. How does it work?
Sure. Well, in an immediate sense, municipal police are responsible for everything that happens in their city. They are governed by their police services boards, who handle the shaping of policing policies and practices to make sure they reflect community priorities. Then as we go up through complaints, there are a number of sort of umbrella agencies that lead up to the Solicitor General of Ontario, Sylvia Jones, the OIRPD, Independent Police Review Director, who takes complaints and initiates investigations into systemic issues, and the OCPC, the Ontario Civilian Complaints Commission, which is a little bit like the OIRPD, but more powerful in the sense that it can make binding decisions. It has adjudicative powers. So it's all very carefully designed to filter problems before they get up to the Solicitor General, who ultimately is responsible for the administration of policing and justice in our province.
Well, that's interesting. Matt, maybe you could pick up the story. The Solicitor General, we're told, sort of has the last line of authority on this. But I suspect people are under the impression that it's actually the police chief who's in charge of everything. Not the case?
There's two different elements occurring here. Everything that was just described is completely accurate, with the exception of it is completely insulated interior. So if there are issues occurring within a police department, none of that is available to those within the police department. So whether you're sworn or civilian, whether you're even like myself as part of the head of the union, which is independent of the organization, none of those mechanisms of looking at oversight or requesting oversight is available to anybody on the inside. And it's very funny, Steve, as I was getting ready here, reading the title of, it's Ontario's policing model broken. I've been doing this for over a decade. And although I'm sure, we all have a different element of where we come from on this panel, I think we're all in agreement that there are significant issues within policing, and it is indeed broken.
Well, Sandy, let me pursue that a little more with you. Who does the chief answer to?
Well, in terms of a policy or strategic direction, the chief would answer to the board. But there's an old principle with respect to the board's role, and that is nose in, fingers out. So the board can get involved on a strategic level, on a policy level, but it cannot direct the chief on an operational issue. So if it's an operational issue, if it's a tactical issue, that's up to the chief, not up to the board. The board cannot direct that.
Do you think the way it currently sits, where it's nose in, fingers out, do you think that's the right balance in terms of who exercises authority?
Yes, I certainly do. I think the problem is that the expectation of a board is that the noses in will be the board's ability to have a robust mechanism for questioning what is happening. And there's a fundamental problem there, as I see it, in that there's a power imbalance between the board and the chief. So whereas it seems like it's set up to succeed, it's actually set up to fail.
Karima, you were there. You took a lot of videos and brought a lot of what was happening at the Freedom Convoy to the rest of the country through your social media feeds. And I wonder, as you looked at it, what failures do you think occurred when it came to policing the Freedom Convoy?
The most obvious thing I can think of is that trucks were allowed to set themselves up and really entrench themselves in front of Parliament Hill and in other parts of the city where it ought to have been possible to prevent that from happening. So, for example, thinking of Parliament Hill, which sits with water behind it and one street in front of it. I was there on the very first day watching officers direct trucks to park in front of Parliament. And I think that there was maybe a mismatch in expectation versus reality on the part of officers. But this welcoming approach really carried over throughout the convoy. And even when police were seemingly putting their foot down and saying no more occupation, the protest supporters had advance notice that there would be a cutoff to fuel supply, for example. And that allowed them to plan ahead and start carrying jerry cans everywhere. So at every juncture, there was an opportunity for the protesters to respond. And I believe that they believe that police were supporting them in their efforts.
Well, in a moment, we'll pick up on that phrase you just used, that it ought to have been prevented. But before we do that, let's just show a little snippet of something that you might be referring to. This is a video of an Ontario provincial police officer talking to convoy supporters on their way to the Ottawa protest. Okay, Sheldon, if you would.
Don't run with your lights on. Okay. All right. Absolutely. I get what you guys are doing.
I know.
I support you guys 100%.
Thank you.
All right.
That's what we like to hear.
So,
awesome.
I haven't been to Ottawa. A lot of us are.
Yeah.
Heard nothing but great things for our protest. Everybody's very
Wonderful.
polite, very thankful.
Yeah.
We just want to make sure
peaceful.
that everybody's good. And when you
Yeah.
got these lights going, you're causing a lot of confusion on the road.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, I want some feedback to that conversation. Sandy, can you tell me whether you thought the officer's comments were appropriate?
No, I don't think so. I think it was, officers have a certain amount of discretion that they can use in a situation. And not being there and seeing something, a clip, it's hard to pass judgment. But in general, what the expectation is that a police officer will take an action and they have the discretion of deciding whether they should. I mean, if you use the example, if you're driving down the highway and you're doing 110, a police officer sees you, they don't necessarily have to pull you over for that. They have that discretion. Similarly, in a protest situation, the officer can decide that perhaps the best course of action for them to take is none, or is a one that doesn't further doesn't escalate the situation. So you would absolutely expect an officer to act professionally, to follow their code of ethics, and to ensure that they're doing everything they can to make sure illegal activity doesn't happen. So that is what our expectation would be. And where there are instances where that failed to happen, I think everybody's in agreement. They should be investigated, and disciplinary action should be taken against any officers that failed to live up to their duty.
Matt, what do you think of what you just saw?
These are absolute red herrings. An officer's opinion around any movement, whether go over the last decade of protest, either against the police or whatever protest occurred, would have the Ottawa Police and policing. Ottawa Police has 2,000 members, and OPP is an incredibly large organization. You're going to have varying opinions. At the end of the day, again, red herrings. There's some desperate attempt to suggest that the officers on the ground, whether they're sympathetic or not, because there were plenty of officers who were not sympathetic to the convoy protest, but yet it's not being shown. And the reason for that is that there is, again, this desire to place the blame on the frontline officers, and it's moot. This is a chain of command situation. This demonstration awaited orders from up top, the executive or whoever was in charge in that room to issue orders. They never came. And that's where the officers were caught in this position where at the end of the day, they were trying to find media, public, whatever, the frustrations were mounting, and they wanted to find somebody to blame. And they were looking at these small snippets of an officer's potential sympathy or empathy towards demonstrators. That occurs in every demonstration. You have officers doing TikTok videos with other demonstrators, and it's lauded as heroic and a great community event. In this case, all of a sudden it's turned into some pariah that how dare they do it. And that must be the reason why there was no actions at the convoy protest. There is no actions because there was no orders issued. And that is as simple as that.
Michael, red herring, the officers' opinions?
Well, there's no doubt that these attitudes exist in police organizations because they exist in society. And police officers are drawn from society, and we have far-right attitudes in society, anti-vax attitudes in society. We'll find them in the police organizations, as Union Head Scoff just said. But is it large enough to explain how the police behaved in Ottawa? I doubt that very much. We do know that the plan in place was to allow protesters to come into downtown Ottawa in exchange for a promise that they would be staying for a limited period of time. So much was said by Interim Chief Bell at the Standing Committee for Public Safety about 10 days ago. So it was a plan that allowed things to get to this point. It turns out that that plan was based on bad intelligence and a misreading of the intentions of certain streams of the leadership of the protest organizers.
All right, Karima, I guess it's possible that the officer said what he said in order to ingratiate himself with the people in the truck in the hopes that that might calm things down. Is that a reasonable interpretation of what we just saw?
It's a potential interpretation, but I would say that video was quite consistent with the attitudes that I observed on the ground and the interactions that I saw between officers and protesters. And of course, there is going to be various attitudes among the officers in the police service, but by and large, I think that there is something to interrogate here, how cozy the officers were with this particular type of protest and the discretion that we heard about, the disparities in how that discretion gets applied, I think is also worth looking at. So I don't think that that's a red herring at all. In fact, I think it's a fair indicator of what was happening.
Well, let me do a follow-up with you on that, Karima, because Matt suggested that police officers can believe whatever they want, but the reality is when the orders come down, they'll follow the orders of what they're supposed to do. Could you not say that for this situation here? The officer in question in that video may very well have been supportive of what the convoy activists were all about, but he had no orders to do anything, so he did what he thought was right at the moment.
I think deciding to express one's opinion while in uniform is a choice. And so that officer made a choice. And as to whether he was calming the people down in the truck, to my understanding, they were on their way to Ottawa. So I don't see how that interaction could be read as anything but bolstering their confidence that they have support, whether or not police are allowed to express that. And I can't speak to what the orders were, but what I observed was police being extremely friendly in ways that I have not seen the same approach at other types of protests.
Matt, do you think it's fair to say that those kinds of comments, which look quite supportive of what the aims of the activists were, perhaps emboldened the activists to either do more or be tougher or hang around longer, et cetera, knowing that they thought they had basically cover from the officers on site?
No, I don't agree with that. And to add to a comment there, this is exactly what occurs at every protest. Every demonstration has officers interacting in similar context. They will be having good conversations with people. And in fact, more often than not, they're encouraged to have good conversations with people. There were no orders issued. Every officer that you're seeing having discussions with people on the ground in the front lines, they're not in the room making the plans. They're not in the rooms making the decisions around who, what vehicles get let in, what are the numbers, when do they get removed. These officers have to live day to day in frontline position with the demonstrators. What occurred in this from a frontline perspective is absolutely no different than what's occurred for the last decade in every other demonstration, with the distinction being, and hence this is a red herring, is that what is lacking and what did not occur was decisions to be made at the appropriate times of when to remove them. But those decisions come from an executive level. They do not come from the ground level.
All right, let me pursue that with Sandy for a second. Sandy, I have to tell you, I mean, I've covered hundreds of protests in my time, and I have seen police move in to disperse protesters for a lot less provocation than what was demonstrated in Ottawa. So I guess the question, as Matt put it, persists. Why was there apparently no direction coming from senior levels to the officers on the front lines to do something?
The board does not get involved with the directing what happens, and it is not party to specific commands that were given or not given. What I can tell you, excuse me, from a board's perspective was that the plan originally was to allow the protesters to come, as has happened, as Matt Scoffit said and Michael Campbell said, this has happened many, many times before. There's been a protest, there's been convoys before. They've come to town, they've done their protest, and then they've left. And that was the expectation, I think, for the most part, as to what was going to happen this time. I personally got a sense of a huge shift that occurred, and I would agree. I don't think the individual officers' actions were nearly as important as some people would like to make it out. What I saw is a really ground swelling shift was when the money, the millions of dollars started rolling in through the GoFundMe, the Give, Send, Go, and then ultimately Bitcoin. Protesters that would otherwise have been expected to leave town suddenly were offered financial assistance to stay in town. They didn't have to worry about paying tickets. They didn't have to worry about buying gas for their vehicles. They didn't have to worry about accommodation, and they didn't have to worry about losing their trucks if the trucks were seized. It changed, in my view, the relationship between the police and the demonstrators and the city. And I know that as a board, one of the questions I asked is, and one of the things I never understood is, why were trucks allowed to re-enter the city after they had left the demonstration? And then we saw trucks that were re-entering. And that made no sense to me. And that was one of the questions. As a board, our role is to ask questions, to have a robust mechanism to ask questions. And we asked, why are these trucks being allowed to re-enter? And the answer we were given was that the protesters had a charter right to bring their vehicles downtown. That made no sense to me. But this, in part, is part of the difficulty the board has. We don't have the resources to challenge the powers that be, the chief, the senior executive. These are the knowledgeable people. They have their legal counsel present. The city's legal counsel is present. So when we're given an answer like that as a board, we don't have the ability to challenge it. But it didn't make sense. And I think it was something that allowed the protest to go on longer. But in addition, there were other issues.
Well, hang on. Don't get to the other issues yet, because we've got a lawyer here, and I want to pursue that idea of they had a charter right to protest, to assemble, to have those trucks in the shadow of Parliament Hill. Okay, Karima, you're a lawyer. Does that make sense to you?
That does not make sense to me. There is, of course, charter rights that protect political expression, the right to assembly, so on and so forth. But there's nothing specifically that allows for the use of commercial vehicles as a tool of protest, especially where there is ample evidence that these vehicles were detrimental, whether it was through the honking, through the idling and the noise pollution, the fumes coming out. The charter is right there in Section 1. There are limits that can be imposed.
No, there are limits,
that's something that would be litigated after the fact. But I don't see that using a truck is something that the charter protects.
No, I appreciate that there are limits on all of our fundamental freedoms in this country. Having said that, it's right there in black and white in the charter. We do have the freedom to assemble. And that's what they were doing. They were assembling. Now, obviously, they had trucks, they had horns, et cetera, et cetera. Could they reasonably conclude that they were in compliance with the charter?
I believe that many thought that they were in compliance with the charter, and the way that it was enforced gave them reason to think that. But the logistics of this type of operation, preventing the actual trucks, does not mean that you're preventing an individual from protesting. And so the truck and the person are not inseparable.
Well, as we all know, it eventually did come to an end, and I'm going to ask our director, Sheldon Osmond, to roll the video of that, because we've got some pictures of how it all eventually did break up. And yes, the police did move in. It was about 3.5 weeks later, and they I guess you could say, effectively cleared out the protesters. There were some police on horseback that got the job done. Also took place, of course, at the Ambassador Bridge in Windsor, where the police moved in. And eventually it came to an end after almost a month. Michael, I should get you, I guess, to sort of sum up whether you thought there were any successes in the way that the police handled this situation.
Well, ultimately, although it's a low bar, there was no loss of life or major injury, which is incredible when you consider the number of people involved and the actual need to use multiple police organizations working together to move people along. It's incredibly confusing, though, the stories we're hearing of lack of orders coming down from the police executive, lack of understanding as to whether or not it was a charter right to have trucks in the downtown core, the police services board being confused about what questions they're allowed to ask and answer. These are the typical problems that plague policing governance right across the province, not limited to Ottawa. We see it in Thunder Bay. We saw it in Toronto around the G20. It's far more complicated than anything we've seen or got to in terms of individual police officers. And it's going to be systematically addressed through the inquiries that are to come. So in terms of successes, very little injury and a chance now to get this system right through the inquiries that are coming.
I mean, that's probably worth hammering on a little more because, okay, January 6th, Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. I mean, that was a mob scene. And there were, again, people who were initially assembling to enjoy their, they don't call it the charter there, the Bill of Rights freedoms, and people died. And that was a disgrace, what happened there. We didn't see any of that in Ottawa. It got messy, but it didn't get fatal. And no doubt, Karima, maybe I can bring you in on this, no doubt the police chief, Peter Sloly, who understandably is keeping his head down these days and not talking about this, no doubt that was a huge part of what motivated him not to move in a dramatic way at the get-go. Do you think Peter Sloly has been scapegoated as a result of all of the 11th hour look back at this thing?
Hindsight is 20/20. So I think in assessing the former chief's response, that's going to be an element of it. But there's an irony to the fact that a Black police chief was ultimately, he resigned because of mass lawlessness on the part of a movement that is closely tied to white supremacy. And I know that part of his mandate in coming to Ottawa had to do with addressing racial discrimination, inequities within the force. And so whether that made him unpopular, whether that affected the actions of frontline officers, I can't say. And I think any subsequent inquiry will shed more light. But there is something odd about the way things played out.
Well, Sandy, Karima says that the police chief resigned. And of course, it begs the question, did he resign or was he forced out? Can you help us with that?
Absolutely, he resigned. There's no question.
The police board didn't take him aside and say, we think it'd be a good idea if you resigned?
No, we did not. This was his decision. He decided to resign, and we accepted his resignation.
Okay. Michael, do you think that he's been scapegoated in this?
It's definitely, you cannot pin it all on Peter Sloly. I'm very concerned about leaks that apparently came from upper levels of policing to the CBC and elsewhere, that the chief at the time had no plan. We now know that's not true. It's been admitted as such by the new interim chief, Steve Bell. There was indeed a plan. We've been hearing from leaks that Peter Sloly was some sort of bully and tyrant who didn't make use of the talent in the room. Again, all I can say there is, if that's true, why did we not hear about it during the 2 years of his tenure? Why all of a sudden in an emergency? So it's much more complicated than saying Peter Sloly is to blame. And there's going to be multiple inquiries. I hope they have the authority to get into this in detail.
Matt, it is a fact that obviously some surreptitious tape recordings of conversations with the former chief were made and leaked, which is highly unusual. It does potentially point one to believe that maybe there were forces that wanted him out and therefore urged him to fall on his sword. What's your view as to whether or not you think he's been scapegoated in all of this?
Well, as I was saying all the way throughout, the protest. I was asked often for comment, and I didn't believe it was fair to point the finger at Peter during that time. It was the middle of the battle, the war, the metaphorical war, and there would be plenty of time afterwards to have those discussions and look at it. I just need to be absolutely clear on something. These inquiries or these audits that are going to occur, they are in no way going to resolve or uncover what occurred here. It's not going to happen. There is no authority within these inquiries to sanction, to create an environment where this will be corrected. This will have a lot depending on who answers or who's even asked to answer. So there'll be selective witness participation. You will not get a full picture of what occurred. So just to manage everyone's expectations, this will not be resolved through the inquiry.
No power to subpoena witnesses in this case?
Well, regardless, who are they subpoenaing? Who are they looking at? Because there is absolutely no appetite, from what I'm seeing, to have a full and frank conversation about bringing forward the right people to have the discussion and to go forward and actually be candid, or even to provide an environment where they can speak candidly. That is impossible in policing. It is a tyrannical, bullying situation. And to Michael's point around how come we're only hearing about personality issues now, this is the systemic problem within policing. It is an insulated culture. The members cannot go forward but through the Police Services Board. Sandy and I could have this conversation for hours because we've been dealing with this for 10 years. But it is an insulated environment. It's an insulated culture. There is no ability to out or to force the issues forward. So what may be an issue going into a crisis is exacerbated in the crisis because it was never dealt with during the years prior to it. And that's not just on Chief Foley. This is in every, as Michael's mentioned, this is in every police department in Ontario. This is a systemic issue in Ontario. It is a broken culture. It is a broken system.
Well, Sandy, I know if I were running the inquiry, I'd certainly want to be able to have the right to subpoena the highest levels of both political and police and civilian leadership in this case to find out whether former Chief Slowly's allegations that he was understaffed, he was underfunded, he didn't get the resources that he thought he needed to bring this to a conclusion. I'd certainly want to go down that rabbit hole and pursue all that. Do you think we're going to get some answers on that?
Sadly, I share Matt's concerns. I don't think that we're setting up a process that's going to see transparency and see the right people ask the right questions. So I absolutely share his concerns that there's an expectation that there will be proper answers given, and I am very, very skeptical that will happen. And I would also agree this is a much broader problem than what you see in Ottawa. What this demonstration did was bring it all to a head. It brought a lot of the weaknesses and flaws in the system to a head, and it shone a spotlight on them. But there are, as I've said, the boards are set up to fail. There's a total power imbalance and an inability. If you look at a board staffing, the board has 2 members, and they're up against an extremely well-staffed executive and service, and somehow or other we're supposed to be on an even playing field when it comes to asking tough and robust questions, and it just doesn't happen, and it's a serious flaw in the system. In which case, Karima, what's the way forward here?
Well, I think another success of policing in the context of the convoy is that they really made a strong argument for reallocating some resources that go to police. And I think that is the way forward. And it has to do with taking resources and putting them elsewhere, because I think Ottawa citizens lost a great deal of trust in police and their ability to keep the city safe. And I think that we need to have discussions about police budget with this specific context in mind, and thinking even of the police board, set up to fail, but also there were members of the police board who were apparently attending and participating in the protest. And so lots of questions. We probably won't get full answers because there is this culture of lack of transparency. But I think the way forward is to divest, and I think that might happen.
Sandy, we should just fact check that point Karima just made. You will acknowledge there were members of the Police Services Board in Ottawa who did attend the demonstration and were seen to be supportive. Is that fair to say?
No.
No?
No, it isn't. First of all, she used the term members plural. There is one member who was accused of being supportive of it in the first weekend. From what I've heard from that member, he denies that he did anything wrong or improper or in any way compromised his position on the board. But that's not for me to decide. With respect to the other members, I could tell you, and I think this is very important, as far as I know, all of us took the opportunity to do ride-alongs with police through to see firsthand what was happening on the front lines, what was happening with the demonstration. Personally, my 3 children live downtown. My daughter doesn't have a car, walks everywhere. She wears a mask. She was physically body checked into a wall by demonstrators. We personally experienced the damage that was done to the people and to the residents of the city. And I think it should be very clear that I mean, I personally suffered as well during this. There was absolutely no sense around the board table of encouraging or any question about that at all. So I think that should be very clear. There is one accusation against one member. With respect to the resignation of the other provincial members, I have no idea what happened there or why.
Okay, let me save my last 30 seconds here for Michael to talk about the way forward. We've heard about the imbalance in power between what the board can do and what the police service itself can do. What do we do about that?
The big thing on police governance is the province now has community safety and well-being plans required for every municipality. We've been putting them together in every city. It's about mobilizing all of the agencies that contributed to community safety and thinking about how the police best coordinate with them. If you've got networks for policing on the ground, as we soon will, it's going to be that much more complicated to do proper policing governance. Since we're moving to this new model and the old system of policing governance hasn't been working so well, it will be time to catch that model up to the new reality of network policing on the ground. And people like Matt and the police union will be thinking very carefully about how their members fit into all of that and making sure that the police are properly represented in that new community safety model.
Okay, I know this has been a hugely controversial issue, and I'm grateful to the 4 of you for coming on to TVO tonight and helping us understand it a little bit better. Thanks, you 4.
Thank you kindly.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.